Dope.
Hello, welcome to Beastly Theories. I'm your host, Andy McGrath. Now, today we have a very special guest with us. I'd like to say a very big hello and welcome to celebrated author and literary lycanthrope, Linda Godfrey. Linda, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Well, for a literary lycanthrope on a rainy day, I think pretty well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. That just popped into my head today, and I thought that has to be the name of this episode, literary lycanthrope, because I could barely say it. I had to practice it a number of times as well.
Well,
Okay.
just so people don't think I'm the lycanthrope. So you'll have to say
That's right.
lycanthrope. I'm not even sure the right word to use. Tracker, and then you're losing your alliteration. So I'm just messing it up for you. Sorry.
Lycanthropic librarian?
Um, Well,
No.
no, it's a lycanthropic because people will. I work very hard so people understand. I don't really believe in solid human bodies turning into solid
Uh-huh.
like bodies, and I'm pretty sure I wouldn't ever do it myself.
No, of course not. I mean, no matter the situation. And I just, for a matter of record, I don't believe that either. That essentially that humans are turning into animals. Although I do understand how some people do find that very valid. Now, I've just read your new book. I know what I saw. It's just been released. I was really thoroughly impressed, almost overwhelmed actually with the variety of the creatures in it. It's almost a compendium of the North American unknown. It's really sensational. I just to start. And without going through your history, I think a lot of people know a lot about you already. Could you just take us through some of your favorites from the books, from some of the more strange and unusual beasts that you cover in it?
In the new book?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, the main idea behind this book, and maybe why it seems to range so far, is because I was originally asked to create a book about mythology, ancient mythology, and contemporary urban legend. And the editor had a very long, kind of a lengthy title for it, but I kind of got what he wanted. And then unfortunately, he was no longer at the company. There was a big merger between Penguin and Random House, and the staff's some wonderful people were no longer with us, and so I had to kind of recast the story. And I also had the chance then to make it a little bit more my own idea, because as soon as I started looking at any kind of legends at all, I realized that there were so many that echoed one another and also echoed the past, and then seemed to reemerge in the future. Very ancient things that come out in the modern times as something like Slender Man. We have all these weird stick figure, shadowy type things, and where do you look for that? And my question has always been, well, it's like the chicken or the egg. Which came first, the monster or the myth? Were there these actual creatures that were then sort of just written about or spoken about over campfires until they took on their own life, and then these creatures they were talking about sort of emerged from some joined human consciousness, and that sounds very weighty indeed, but there are a lot of people who believe that sort of thing. Or was it that the creature was just read in and had been with us in the past but no longer was? Or are they sort of Jungian archetype that we carry in our minds, these animal-human combinations that we often don't even know what to call? But it seems too unlikely that people all over the world would come up with some sort of a very tall, huge, lumbering, hominid type, almost human, proto-human creature like Bigfoot. There's something extremely similar. They're not always quite as big, but it's this, half man, half ape sort of being that shows up everywhere. How can that be if, we have all these separated cultures, separated by time and great distance, and we still are coming up with these same beasts? The same thing about canines, and of course I started with the upright canines, and then I realized there were all sorts of really odd ones that couldn't be explained. And most of the time people don't worry about gender, but I I did suddenly notice that I seem to have a pileup of dog woman or dog lady sightings. I had one very intriguing one that came in from a gentleman over in one of the eastern states, and he actually encountered what the whole area of high schools was in Pennsylvania was calling the dog lady or dog woman. And they never said, I never got satisfactorily out of him or his two friends that were co-witnesses, why they particularly thought it was a dog woman lady. There wasn't anything to really, it's just that that's what the legend said, so that's what they assumed that they were seeing. Yeah, so we have everything in this book from that sort of legendary canine that could be upright, or this particular one jumped off a rocky edge that was abutting a road, and these people were driving on the road, and it jumped down probably like 10 feet down to the road bed right in front of their truck, engaging them in a very direct way. So in a lot of ways, that's sort of like the modern day Beast of Bray Road or Michigan Dogman. But then there are other ones. There's an older the legend that goes back to Civil War days in eastern Michigan, and that one is called the Witchy Wolves of Omer Plains. And in the old days, things that looked like werewolves and witches were almost automatically combined in like all the European witch trials and much literature. And this happened to be regarding something that people considered both a witch-related happening and that it might not mean there's a crone mixing potions. Witchy just means it might refer to a type of magic or magical process. And then the wolves, and this one involves Civil War soldiers lost in war and coming back, the remains of them in a shoebox, and then something happens to the grave where he's buried, and the witchy wolves are involved in this. And then it comes all the way to present day, where modern day teenagers are still going out to this area of the plains near Omer, Michigan, and hearing wailing in the trees, and sometimes something runs at their car, and sometimes they'll catch a glimpse of a wolf-like feature. And it's just kind of interesting how this thing is woven through time. Then we get into things, I don't think I even really touched like the flying bat-like creatures or the giant birds, but we do get into other things like upright cat people. I talked a little bit about those. There's some Western spirit type cats called the chinty, which can also change into other features. It's almost like the Irish water horse that looks one way and then can change around to other things. So we have that, and then we have a great mystery all over. And I know that you have this a lot in the UK, which is the black mystery cats that look like black panthers. They look kind of like mountain lions or pumas. But there are not supposed to be, for sure, any wild cat, or excuse me, any of the. I'm sorry, I need a drink. Just 1 second. I drink of water.
That's okay. Sure.
Mountain lion is what I was trying to get at.
Sure. And I mean, talking about the mystery big cats, actually, I know that you're currently making a documentary on this phenomenon in your part of the country.
Right.
And it is a big subject here in the UK. I've taken 4 big cat sightings today.
Wow.
But with the UK, I mean, they were in the hundreds, if not thousands, and there's a very obvious origination point for them. So we had the Dangerous Wild Animals Act in 1976, and it was very prohibitive about the types of enclosures and roaming space that these big cats needed. And there was even an article that came out today about one very well-known big cat keeper that released his big cats in the Malvern Hills and not far from Birmingham, and actually released a lot of other big cats for other owners. It's sort of a controlled release before this act came in, because everybody knew they weren't going to be able to afford it, and at the same time, none of the zoos were set up to receive any of these animals, so they just let them go. And we're looking at probably fourth generation descendants.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I tracked down Terry Hooper, who for many years kept track of this black. Well, I think the black and the tan creature sightings in his area. He was a really wonderful originator of some of the superhero type of comic books there in the UK. Kind of a
Oh wow!
yeah, really. Most people don't realize that, but
I
he
didn't know that.
also he had this secondary duty of the police would call him when there were reports, and he would record them all, and had quite a big stash. I think he finally had to stop, but we had a very similar person here in western Wisconsin who somehow found out about me and my, trying to save stories of the Beast of Bray Road. And he had been taking reports of great mystery cats in western Wisconsin. And it's been known that there have been at least a few of the regular tan mountain lions kind of slipping their way east for some years. But there are many, many, many more reports than the local authorities will admit to. And then the crazy part is that there have been, by his count, and his name is Stephen Stanek, deserves a lot of credit, and by his count, there have been well over 150 known reports just in the past 3 or 4 decades, right within an 18-mile radius of one little town, Hillsborough.
Wow.
And talk about monumental coincidences. Why am I always connected with these things? But both of my maternal and my paternal grandmothers lived in this little 18-mile radius. One lived in Hillsborough, was a school teacher there. The other one lived on a farm on a ridge where there were these things seen, not by my grandmother that I know of, but right within this area they both were. So, I have some personal interest in it too. I spent a lot of summers in Hillsborough. I know the area very well. And it's very odd compared to the rest of Wisconsin and even many parts of the U.S. You drive into that area and you open your eyes and you look around and you'd swear you were in Colorado. It's all rock cliffs, river canyons. It's just different plants. It's very, very, it looks like a place where cougars would live. And the weirdest thing, I started to say this about a minute ago and kind of got lost in the explanation, is that well over half of those 150-some reports are of black panther-like creatures.
Aha.
And most of these sightings are in daylight from fairly close. People will see it in their yard from their front porch or in their field while they're out in the field, or 10 feet in front of their car or their truck as they're driving around. And most of them are not afraid to tell. Steve Stanek thinks there are still many untold from the people that still are afraid to tell about it. But there's a huge number that were just more than willing to have their names known and have this reported, because they get so frustrated after a while of nobody believing them. The people who have seen it believe them, but the ones who haven't, oftentimes your own family, doesn't believe, and then the Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, poo-poos them too, and so I felt like the people there deserved an outlet and a place where others could listen to them, and actually that is all in the book. There are 2 chapters relating to those things, and then a long appendix of just quick quotes of things that people have seen, so people can get, and I still couldn't even fit them all into that appendix. Just maybe half of them got in there because there are just so many. But so that was a start, and then the witnesses we had were so stellar. We have one woman who has a PhD who spent time as a staff assistant with the very well-known Florida Panther Project, where the cougars were dying out in Florida. And so they brought in mega cougars from Texas to mate with them and kind of enlarge and help that population bloom. And it has. It's worked very, very well. And yeah, so that, and you probably heard a little tinkling sound on my computer there. I just had a note from somebody who wrote dog experience. So I mean, these things are coming in all the time. But I really wanted people to know about these reports and felt that this was a good way to do it, and luckily I happened to have it. It was like everything aligned, all the stars aligned. My youngest son has a film degree from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, and he needed something to make a good reel. I happened to inherit a small amount of money from my uncle who grew up on a farm in that same area. And my husband and I were thinking about fixing our deck, which it has holes in it, and we're like, well, we could fix the deck, or we could make a movie. Fix the deck, make a movie. Fix the deck. Guess which one?
To me, that choice is very, very simple.
Exactly. Yeah, and there were other things.
Yeah, you'll be falling through the holes on that deck for some time to come, I imagine.
Well, it's crazy because in the process of this, I ended up finding out that my grandma. Well, for one thing, there were UFOs seen above Hillsborough in the late 40s, early 50s, before they were really a big thing, and these farmers didn't know what they were. So there's that. That's all in the book, and an inordinate number of plane crashes. I talk about, and there was no real flight path through that area at the time, and fatalities. And right east of Hillsborough is a 20-mile range of hills that are made up of a type of pink quartzite that is some of the oldest earth in the world. And when you have that amount, that's a huge amount of quartz type material, which is used for radio stations and things when you want to have communications. It has all kinds of uses. So I just opened up this big can of worms, and my grandmother who lived there, I found out, was a spy during World War II for the U.S. because she's perfectly fluent in Czech and in English. And my other grandma, who lived right there and didn't even know her until my dad started courting my mom, I inherited all her letters, and I found out that she was corresponding with someone who was involved in some type of aero communications with the Germans. And when after VE Day, she was trying her darndest to get out of Germany, and somehow latched on to my other grandmother as somebody to try and sponsor her. And she was drawing little diagrams of what they knew about the different UFOs at the time. And I included the letterhead and all that, the envelope address, so you can see that it's genuine, and her little diagrams, and discussed why they looked like upside down teacups rather than saucers, and how the propulsion systems were in the flare of the bottom of this kind of bell shape, not in separate wings. Now, how would that lady know this? And my grandmother, that grandmother had a 5th grade education, probably had no idea what she was talking about. But she wrote her this, and I have so it's just really odd. I feel like I'm at the bottom of some sort of, wildcat vortex. I'm not sure why it's all.
I think it's very. I speak to people all the time about this kind of thing, and it's very odd how people like yourselves, they fall into this world, and you, as you say, you did kind of fall into it originally when you started investigating the Bray Road Beast. How they find other things in their past with other relatives that have something to do with it, or at least to do with this world of the strange and unusual. That doesn't surprise me at all. I did just want to say one thing very quickly, though. As a British person, it's very funny that you said teacups. The UFOs look like teacups instead of saucers, because, of course, the first thing I thought was, well, the saucer is missing from that teacup.
Oh.
Because that's how we would drink it, with a teacup and a saucer to hold it.
Well, that's funny. I like that.
Yeah, sorry. But yeah, regarding these things, I mean, obviously the book, and I recommend it to anybody, literally was like reading, a very, very interesting compendium. There was just so much that you could even flick from part to part if you wanted to, not just go from the start to the finish. I thought it was really awesome, but I started thinking about something I face all the time is, how do you validate the credibility of your witnesses? Are there secrets, techniques used to expose a hoax or somebody that perhaps is over imaginative? Are there any red flags that you look for?
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. That's something that I dealt with from the very, very beginning because I was really skeptical. That when you hear that people are saying there's a werewolf on a certain road near your
Yes.
hometown, at the time I'm just like, really? And I mean, I had read a lot of science fiction. My dad was into that, and I liked follow. I had followed even the men's magazines talking about the Yeti, back in the '60s, Ivan Sanderson, and all those things. So I was quite young at that time, but my dad really liked these, so they were available to me. And now I'm losing my
No, it's fine. It's fine.
lost my train of thought there. So I'm a very vision oriented person, and when I started talking about Ivan Sanderson, all these visions of those Yeti illustrations from the old magazines were popping into my head. But back to verifying these people. At that time, it was a little easier than it is now because they were all within a small area, and I could go and physically visit them and interview them and write down my impressions of how they spoke and everything. And I was actually surprised and impressed by that first group because they were just so serious about it. Some were, when they talked about it, they would start shaking again, and even tears in a couple of cases. And I thought, well, and they were all very different. It wasn't like, a little group of teenage guys. There was a teenager, there was a junior high age girl and boy who'd been part of a sledding party that saw it. There was a middle-aged lady who was a factory worker who drove to work at night. There was a young single mom who was managing a restaurant bar in Elkhorn, but not imbibing. There were several farmers, a man who had a high clearance at the Milwaukee airport at the time. So it was a very diverse group of people, and the other thing was that they were all willing to give their addresses, their information, and be interviewed. And I thought, well, nobody pulling a hoax does that because you don't want to make it too easy. Say they decide to come after you and prosecute you for perpetrating a fraud on the public and endangering safety of roadways or something like that, and there they've got all your info to call you right up. So that impressed me too, and I tended to believe, after talking to all of them, that while I didn't know for sure what it was, that there was something, and it was an unusual phenomenon, whether it somehow, as the animal control officer suggested, that it was a coyote that was leaping up, and people were seeing it, and it was just at the top of the leap, but not before or after, which I think is a bigger stretch than anything.
Yes.
Plus, because coyotes are just too small.
I find sometimes with some of the rational, I wouldn't say skeptical, but rational arguments that are used in place of what people see in regards to Nessie or Bigfoot. Sometimes it's a much bigger stretch than the sighting itself.
Exactly.
Because you have to take all these twists and turns to make it fit. In my book, I actually list them as, in the case of lake monsters, as monster imposters. And eel, sturgeon, all these different types of things. And in the case of the Dogman, wolves and coyotes and dogs standing on two legs, or deer, or whatever people might think that they could be seeing instead. But I do understand that it's, I always say it's a big ask to ask anybody to accept that this could possibly be real. So when somebody comes to me with a sighting, I always think, well, first and foremost, do they have any sort of trauma-like, are they exhibiting any trauma-like symptoms? So when they recall the story, are there mundane details included that you don't need, but they're things that they can't forget?
Right.
About a street light that was out, or some strange anomaly in the road that you don't need to know about. Do you look for things like that as well?
I do because I really cannot get around the world. Many people don't believe this is not a high income profession. Right?
Yes.
Right. It's a very niche area of literacy and literature, excuse me, and you just don't make a lot of money, if any. And so I can't be just hightailing it all over the country, and because this thing is, I get reports from everywhere. So very often I'll try and talk to people on the phone, interview them that way, And usually in the course of the storytelling, they'll describe, as you say, little things that don't really have to do with it. Like there was a one that described a type of hatch from a sewer, but it was square. And I happen to know that almost all sewer tops are round, so they don't fall in.
Uh-huh.
It's the only one that can be that does that. And I happen to know that because my husband is a civil engineer that specializes in wastewater management. Treatment. So I had the in on that one, but when I asked him about it, I said, could there have been, like a square or rectangular sewer cover? And he said, oh yes, that's the TS-180 or some number like that. Yes, they're used mostly, with access to electrical areas under buildings, and that's exactly what this would have been. So that's another thing. And I've had some real, I don't know if you read Monsters Among Us. There's one where an entire family was sitting in church and saw the woman sitting in the pew across from them literally change within an instant from a very ordinary, plain, quiet woman into a 7-foot-tall, furry werewolf. It's like her clothes disappeared. Everything just changed in an instant. It wasn't like one of these long Hollywood transformations. And you need to really have a lot of faith in some people to put that kind of a story in. Yes. And so those people were not really too close to me, but I managed to meet up with them in person 3 different times. Took my husband, the truthometer guy, along with me, so it wouldn't be just my opinion.
Yeah.
I had them describe where the church was and I had all of that stuff with the minister. Every single little bitty thing they said checked out, down to the smallest detail. And moreover, they were just sort of salt of the earth people. He was a former Vietnam veteran with some artistic ability and had worked, I think, as a mechanic afterwards. She was just a content woman who worked mostly at home, but she had done some work at the church where this happened too. Uh-huh. And just people that, why would they seek me out and tell me this story and make up all kinds of odd, random things about where the church was and what had happened to it and all that kind of thing. They just wouldn't. There's no reason for that.
It doesn't make sense. And of course, I mean, there are people sometimes who are suffering mentally in some way, and
yes.
With very clear hallucinations. You don't normally get that in the family group, of course. And as you say, what I always tell people who doubt a lot of witnesses, and of course there are some hoaxes, there's really not much money in being a witness, and if you do earn anything from your coming out to the newspapers or publicly, it's normally local disdain and humiliation. So it doesnn't pay well. And in fact, the payment is in the minus. So
yes. And you cannot pay people for that kind of thing, although they think sometimes because if you do, you will have all sorts of people coming forward wanting to tell you that for the money. It's like, I could go make some cash here. I'll just say that I met a werewolf or whatever. Yeah. So it's that's why it's ethically not done in any sort of journalism unless you are some sort of big shot celebrity, and it's something that all the big newspapers are vying for the first story on. That's a very different thing. This is just ordinary people telling something and volunteering it, that had happened in their lives. And I do send people who volunteer their stories like that and spend a lot of time at it, a copy of the book, but that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody appears, same with me, I normally try to get a copy out and everything like that. Now, there was something, being in your position, having written so many books on these subjects, I was thinking about the werewolf legends of Europe and similar legends in the US and other places. And in your experience, are there direct correlations between the old world and new world descriptions of these animals? And if yes, do you think they may have been influenced by the mythology of European settlers, or are there First Nations reports that predate the European arrival in North America of werewolf-like creatures?
Well, there are a lot of different culture stories of Native Americans that relate to very similar things, but they're very different from the European style, because the European style, you had a man that was somehow through magic able to turn into a werewolf, well, actually, I'm thinking of this. The one that's actually compared a lot to them is in the Native American lands is the I hate to even say its name. It's the one that is really a cannibal type of spirit, where a man is turned entirely into a huge ice monster by this spirit that overtakes him. And then with the old European ones, there's a man who uses magic to appear to be a werewolf. Although that changes too. Sometimes even along or between all of the European countries, they will change. The story changes. It's not monolithic. But what I usually compare it to is there seemed to be a big renaissance of werewolf awareness back in the early centuries or early decades of the 1900s, when we started getting the movies, and you started getting Lon Chaney and all these beast type of movies, and they were actually drawing on European models of the werewolf changing bodily and using the fur belt and that sort of thing. But Hollywood also made up some things, and you can check this out. Some of the earliest directors made up things like even he who is chaste and says his prayers by night, blah blah blah. That was actually made up by one of the directors, and I don't have it in front of me, so I can't say exactly.
No, bit of creative editing.
Right, but the thing is that we have this big cultural tradition where they're fierce, they're eating people. That's the big thing. They're doing evil things. They're making pacts with the devil. Mm-hmm. When I started to investigate these ones on Bray Road, it was sort of like a clean slate, contemporary field of people who had seen something that really, in most, at least these first cases, did not do anything overtly supernatural. These things would see people, and they'd either, if they were on their hind legs, often they would just stand up, and then vice versa. So the big thing they were doing was walking bipedally, which is not it's not a supernatural act. No. Almost any mammal, from just little chipmunks to very much larger ones, even elephants, walk on its hind legs if it's motivated or trained to do so, or has injuries. Usually is the normal reason. You can go on YouTube and put in bipedal bear, and you'll see these videos. This wonderful bear that runs around and just perfectly straight up, in the air, standing that way. So that is not a supernatural thing. And I did have this theory that I called the indigenous Dogman, and I made a sketch of it based on the actual sketches most people have been giving me. And it was scary, but it wasn't anything like these muscle-bound, big, foaming mouth, crazed things that you see today. But these first descriptions of the Beast of Bray Road told of something that was the size of maybe a large wolf with the head of a German Shepherd or a wolf. It could run and stand upright, and people said it had legs that bent backwards, and they were just talking about it being on its regular, normal dog-sized toe pads. And then if you know anything about dog anatomy, it's kind of just like us standing on tiptoe, because you would see our toes and what would be called the base of the foot, and then our heel is up off the ground and pointing backwards, into the air, and those two things just relate. If you look at a dog's leg and you realize that where you're thinking a knee should be, it's actually his heel, then it all becomes very clear. And when people say that to me, and they still do, not comprehending what it is, because most people have not read widely in the subject before they see it. It's normally just kind of
of course,
surprise. But the other big thing was that these people who were reporting the modern ones, to me, were not describing any sense that it was going to eat them or anything like that. Really, it was just more like it was scaring them, intimidating them with a stare right straight in their eyes. Sometimes they'd get the feeling it was trying to communicate something scary to them so that they would leave it alone. But it wasn't like where you had the Beast of Gévaudan, where lots of people, or other ones, where lots of people and livestock were being killed and slaughtered, and sometimes, not even eaten, just it seemed killed for the fun of it. That was a very, very different thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's I think it's really, really fascinating, especially the Dogman phenomenon, which has become very popular recently. And I see that for the last few decades, at least, Bigfoot has been the dominant creature in
Right.
cryptozoology, and
I
there
think
seems to be a
it's
shift in focus happening. And do you think that's shifting more towards the Dogman, or just more of a paranormal aspect to cryptozoology in general?
well, there is that definitely, and both things are actually, I think, kind of fomented by TV. For a long time,
Yes.
this all started with me back in 91, 92, during the New Year's Eve weekend when the first story was published. And it got a lot of press. There was a lot of notoriety, but it sort of quieted down, and then it would surge again every Halloween, although I was still continuing to get pictures and stories from people who, not pictures, but I mean drawings,
Oh, yes.
not photographs by any means, from people all around. And so I knew that it was still an ongoing and real phenomena, but there didn't seem to be a lot of interest in this thing by other people who were already investigating Bigfoot. It was poo-pooed quite a bit, and still is in some places. But I worked at that newspaper for 10 years, I think, and during that time, I did several short updates, when a couple of things had come to light that I thought people would be interested in. That was it. And then it was 2003 before my first books came out. So I had quite a bit of time span in there where I felt like I was just kind of sticking with it. Nobody was terribly interested in it. There was sort of a hardcore fan base, but not great numbers. I wasn't even sure I could get a book printed about it. And in fact, when I first went to the publisher that I began with, which was Trails Media, very, very well-respected area publisher, I showed them my true crime history book, The Poison Widow, first. It was a local thing about a poison widow, a poison murdering widow who had, well, it's a long story, I won't get into that, but it was very, just straightforward true crime history, and they loved it, and they said, well, what else have you got? And so then I gathered up my nerve, and I said, well, would you believe werewolves? And even then, my idea was not to write this big bloodthirsty, savage thing, scary thing. I wanted to write more of a sociologically based review of it, so that people could see what happened to the witnesses and what happened to the town, this little town of Elkhorn, where we had all this interest all of a sudden in places they would rather it not be, because it's a very, very lovely place. I'm glad I have lived there, but it's also very conservative, and it's had a little trouble that way.
Yeah, well, I wonder about that actually. With neighborhoods or towns and cities that are very, very conservative, I think the reticence of people to report something is very high, because of course your future credibility is attached to that within the town. You're the guy who saw the Dogman, and from a personal perspective, you might think, well, should we select Andy for promotion this year? Well, if Andy believes he saw Dogman, perhaps Steve would be a better choice in this instance. Behind closed doors, people have opinions about things, and of course, people can be open-minded as well. It's a different world now. I'm imagining coming out with a sighting like this in the early 90s compared to now. It's a very, very different world, especially with the dawn of the internet. Now, Linda, you've actually had a cryptid encounter, right? You saw Bigfoot several times, and you talk about it in your book a little. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was hard for me to talk about because it's such a mixed thing. In one, and now, for one thing, it was very ironic. I wished that they had been Dogman, but they weren't. If I could have chosen which one to see, it would have made a lot more sense for, my focus of study for it to be upright canines. But it wasn't. They were really obviously. Well, I hate to say they were Bigfoot, because we don't have that complete handle on it being a creature or an animal. We just don't know what it is. But what I parse it out to is I say, well, I know for sure that I saw something I could not explain as any other species besides Bigfoot, and had a really amazing several times, kind of encounter things that happened where
Oh,
I didn't see exactly, but I could see the effects right in front of me, and that's very scary too. And neither of those things really frighten me as much as regular wild animals do. They don't seem to bother. They seem to want to get you out of wherever they are. Like
I've heard that.
Territory or something. So it can
Yes.
be frightening that way. But yeah, I did have these experiences, and I knew that as somebody who's written about them, people were going to go, "Oh yeah, she writes the book.
Of course. Yes.
She's just trying to drum something up." Well, the thing, I've never had to drum up material, and I don't really actively solicit it other than having a box on my website and mentioning it on podcasts and things. But I never have lacked for material, and so that was hard. But then after a while had gone by, a couple of times I'd be interviewing somebody, and I'd think, "Oh, that I saw that, and I should have really said something." And I realized that it was sort of, I felt disingenuous for expecting other people to give up their anonymity, although I don't force people to use their names. I'm happy either way if they want to stay anonymous or not. But either way, for me to take their reports and put them in a book and knowing that I've had the experiences and not use my own just doesn't seem right or honest to me. And so I felt I really had to fess up and do that. And,
Well,
yeah,
I think it's honourable, and I can see exactly why you'd be worried about doing that, because it's a conflict of interest almost,
right.
isn't it? Of course she saw Bigfoot because she's writing about it, and suddenly here it is. But of course, as you say, you primarily are known for Dogman, so it is kind of odd that you would have the opposite experience. I was actually speaking to Monica Rawlins a few weeks ago. I interviewed her. She'd been on many TV programs investigating Bigfoot for a long time, and then accidentally saw a Dogman in a suburban area.
You need to switch animals.
Yes, you could do a swap together. I'm sure she was terrified by the experience, actually, and I'm sure she would willingly give it up. Yeah, I mean, it's a strange thing. Yes. I mean, here too, there are some sightings, and one of the things, the weird correlations between the US and UK with Bigfoot and Dogman sightings, although there's a lot less of both here, was that the Dogman or werewolf type sightings seem to be in the minority compared to Bigfoot sightings to a similar type of percentage to what you have in the US.
I agree. I do agree. I really do. And part of it is because if you're Bigfoot, it's really hard to hide what you are unless they do actually have, invisibility powers or something. You're 6 to 8 feet tall, probably more. You're as wide as three people. You've got this face that looks half human. You're running on your upright on your flat feet, leaving these big prints. Whereas if you're a canine and you look somewhat wolfish, all you have to do is drop down to all fours and trot away, and nobody can say for sure what you were. And if you found a dead one, it would be the same thing. If you found a dead Bigfoot, you would know what you had. And if you found a dead Dogman, because they're really, except in some, there are some more extreme accounts where people say they're more pumped up looking, Arnold Schwarzenegger types, but most of them are built more like just a large size canine. And so you saw a dead one, and people have thought that they have in a couple cases. You would just say, well, that's a kind of a strange looking large dead dog. So I think that's part of it, is that they're able to just drop to all fours and appear to be the neighbor's farm dog if they want to, So, and then I do think there may be fewer of them, really, and I'm not sure why that is, but it bears out in the number, as you say, in the ratio of accounts, although it's been changing. And again, it's the unrelenting television shows, and they're only increasing. I think I taped 5 of them, 5 different shows, episodes on 5 different shows. One was not network. It's been really popular, though. So you have TV just really bringing it out, and then the internet, which we didn't have, really for that whole decade, not to the extent we have it now. For that whole decade where I worked at the newspaper, it was, mostly just what you would see on TV.
Well, I definitely see it. Having been into this genre for a long time, the switch is almost palpable. And there's other things like Mothman and the lake monsters are still in the background for those who want them. Champ and Nessie, Gopogo are still floating around, but
They're
you've
there.
only really got the hardcore guys. I call them the doing the sit-ins. The Scott Mardis and Kate
Right.
Elizabeth and Steve.
Oh, I do that.
Um,
I do stakeouts and spend quite a lot of time in the field. Although one of these last shows really kind of ticked me off because they showed me in my office, at my typewriter doing things like that, and then they showed somebody else doing the things I do out in the woods. In the same woods, the places where I showed them, where we've had some hot spots. And people have even asked me about it. They're like, how come they only showed you at your desk? And then that guy was out there, doing the things in the woods. So, that's something else I contend with a little bit too.
Well, in that case, I mean, I think that's a good point, and maybe a double question here just to finish up for you. So, you've done quite a bit of TV work, and what are the pitfalls of presenting good evidence in this sensationalized soundbite era? As you say, one of the pitfalls for you was being portrayed as the researcher at her desk instead of the researcher who's also out in the field. But are there also pitfalls in terms of perception and how things are presented?
Yeah, that always is a thorny thing. I have never thought that I was really good on camera, in any way, but I do usually accept when I'm asked to do one of these shows because I figure even though they have the power and they have this power by contract that you have to sign, that some are literally like 40 pages long, that they can do whatever they want with what they shoot of you. And so there's always the danger of it being, just kind of messed around with and everything intensified and not coming out quite right. But I always know, too, that at least if I have some part in it, maybe it holds back that sensationalism or gets the truth, holds the truth a little bit closer, up to the lens.
Yeah.
Seen, and I don't have that chance if somebody else takes over and does the whole thing. So, and I've had a couple that were really horrendous. Many of them are very good. Most are somewhere in the middle, and it is when people play with the facts. There was one that ended with they went through pretty well, and I was watching it thinking, well, this isn't too bad. I'm not too badly portrayed. This is right. And they got to the end, and they said, and 5 horses were found with their necks cut and slaughtered on Bray Road. And that it was such a falsehood. And I was still, sort of in touch with that animal control officer. And I called him and I said, John, did I miss something? Were there 5 horses slaughtered, when you were working there? And he said, no. He said, I would have known that. And I said, yeah, I'm sure you would have. And then I would have known. And neither of us, he said, that's just, not right, not true.
I always weigh it up in my mind. Of course, I'm trying to sell the series on this side as well, the Beast of Britain thing, aside from doing the little nepotism podcast that I do here. But it's a strange thing because things have to be entertaining, but also as factual as possible. And real life isn't actually very entertaining. So it's always, how do you mesh those two together? I think Seth Breedlove's doing a wonderful job at it at the moment. Personally,
I liked his he called it the Bray Road Beast is the title. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I encourage people to read it. Definitely. And I'm learning how difficult it is doing this one myself. I've always been on the being filmed side, but I've never been kind of the main director. But I have to say, my son is doing most of the actual work because he's the one who knows how to do all the cameras and how the movie's put together. He's very, very, very into it.
Well, this is an excellent situation because he's your son and your mum. You have power over the director. Fantastic.
Well, he actually does. And and my husband's in on it too. He's kind of a field producer, and he actually sold 2 of his photographs to one of the networks, and so he's billing himself as a professional photographer now.
Fantastic.
Just kind of joking. Yeah,
he's great.
So it's been a real learning experience.
I think it's fantastic. It's fantastic for me to get to talk to you about these things, and I know we sort of kept off the book a little bit, but I was really intrigued by your opinion on these different sort of issues that affect people in the cryptozoology community. I often say to people, I wrote about it as well, that there's a sort of idea that with cryptozoology you should check your reputation at the door, and that you couldn't be further from the truth.
That's about, well, and I like to say, well, I was an art teacher, and a journalist, so I have no professional reputation. It's much easier to start with it that way.
No, definitely. Just before we go, I know you attend a lot of conferences and book signings, etc. Where can people go to hear you speak, get the book signed, follow you around, etc.? Where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, if you go to my blog, which is just lindagodfrey.com, no W's or anything, lindagodfrey.com, and most of the information is on the About page, and you'll find on there, there's a calendar of events, things that I have coming up, which I'm working on updating right now, and you'll also find more bio stuff, and there's a list of books and all that kind of thing. And then on the main page, there's a search button. You can search for Bigfoot branch if you're interested in one of the things that happened to me. My first contact where I really thought it was Bigfoot is there, and many, many other stories, things that don't often make it in the books. So it's all and there's also, if you go to the About page, there's also a contact box where you can just type in if you want to report a story or have a question or something like that.
That's fantastic, Linda. Of course, we'll put all of those links with the show as well, so anybody can just click on and find you there too. And thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real honor to speak to you.
You're welcome, Andrew. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all of your listeners too.
Thank you. Bye bye.